Hello, I'm Michael Mayer, and here we are for our second podcast episode. And in this one, I had a question about feeling pressure at the larynx while singing. And there's a few different possible reasons for this, and I want to go over those and answer that question. And I think this would be good information for everybody. So, first, I want to talk about pressure. I always like to kind of help ourselves figure out a problem by first defining what it is we're dealing with. So when we feel pressure, we recognize what pressure is. So let's think about what pressure is in the context of singing, of using the voice. Because pressure is actually something that's an integral part of vocalization. We make the voice work through the pressure that comes from our breathing, the air pressure from our respiration. And that air pressure from the air in our lungs, which we compress with the abdominal muscles, they push the diaphragm up, and it basically kind of condenses the chest cavity. And so it's just the opposite of inhaling, and it makes the air under pressure inside the chest cavity, inside the lungs. And that air pressure then is applied to the vocal folds, and that's what sets them into vibration. It's a very, very precise sort of relationship. We can't just make pressure and then expect the voice to work. It's a very coordinated. It's a very coordinated sort of relationship. So. But it is important to understand that we are dealing with pressure, and so if we feel pressure, we may be led to think, "Oh, I don't want any pressure," so then we don't have pressure in our body. There's a difference between productive pressure and destructive pressure. There's a difference between using pressure and feeling pressure. So when we're well coordinated, we don't really feel pressure. We may feel a sense of being solid, a sense of being stable, but we shouldn't really feel a sense of being pressurized. If we feel the pressure, then that's a sign that we are out of balance, that somehow the pressure is in a state that is interfering, or some relationship is out of balance. So I think the place to start is to kind of build on just that basic definition. Pressure comes from the air in our body, and it is important. It is a productive thing to feed the vibration. Now, as I've discussed in other articles and other videos, the voice basically works through the relationship of the vibrating material, which is the vocal cords, inside the larynx, between that, the vibrating material, and the air pressure from the breathing. So it's this relationship, and we need to have a balanced relationship, and so that takes coordination. If we breathe too much, then the breath is going to be out of balance with the vibration, and we get various forms of poor vocalization that way. If we're out of balance the other way, because what happens is the vocal cords resist the air pressure, but because of the nature of them, they are elastic. They have certain elastic qualities to them, so they will resist. But at the same time, like our lips, will resist the breath, but then they can also vibrate while resisting. They have this ability, right? So other things that resist pressure will just hold the pressure stopped. So the vocal cords can hold the pressure stopped if they resist that much. Like when we get a struggle sort of thing. When we get these kinds of actions, the glottis is closing, it's slamming shut, and it's resisting the air pressure to a great degree. Obviously, that's not going to produce a very good vibration for our purposes of vocalizing like a musical instrument, producing a nice tone. And then at the same time, if there is if there's not enough resistance, this is what I talk a lot about, because a lot of singers are singing with a lack of appropriate resistance from the vocal cords. And so then there's too much breath. There's really very little resistance there. And then, but most people sing in some kind of way of and you can hear the tone is not terrible, but it's not really very clean, because I'm only using the breath and I'm not balancing it with an appropriate resistance to that breath to find a balance. So if we feel pressure, then in some form or another, something is creating an imbalance in that relationship where there is too much resistance to the breath. And then what happens is, when there's too much resistance to the breath, there's almost an automatic reaction by the body to create more air pressure. And something like that is going to become uncomfortable. This can happen in several different ways. So that gets us now to the starting point of figuring out why is this pressure being experienced, and then what can we do to eliminate it. So one way that, so take this, let's start from this premise that we just established. If we're feeling pressure, then that is a sign that there is an imbalance towards the resistance side of the relationship. So now, it won't work to increase the breath to try to break through that. What we need to do is we need to reduce the resistance. So this is where temporarily doing some sighing or even some breath flow, not as like all the time, but just like or and just do a few exercises. This is very out of balance in that direction, but it helps to kind of reestablish the relationship, so it's not being locked into over resistance. And so that's one thing that we can do right off the bat. But it helps to understand, why is this over resistance happening? Now, a very common reason for too much resistance is because more than the vocal cords are providing resistance. Constriction, the root of the tongue, various combinations of this sort of thing where we're having a closing. Maybe the root of the tongue. That's going to feel like pressure. If we have this often comes up when the singer is thinking in terms of closing the glottis. When we're thinking of closing, what ends up happening a lot of times, especially in the early stages of trying to figure this out, is that we close the whole system. We close the airway, either through deliberately trying to close the glottis, which gives us something like and in certain circumstances that actually is okay temporarily for a period of time for exercise purposes. But if it ever starts to distort, that's the thing. See, that wasn't really very distorted. But if we start if we ever feel like we're pushing down on the larynx, or we are blocking the larynx, then we're resisting more. So we should never feel like we're actively closing the glottis, at least when we're trying to be balanced. Maybe in an early stage, if you're being guided by somebody that's knowledgeable, like myself, then we maybe would do a little bit of deliberate closing like that to kind of strengthen that. But in the long run, we don't stay there. That's only just an exercise to strengthen. So deliberate closing and applying pressure on top of the larynx. There should never be pressure down on the larynx. This is why I always emphasize the importance of the smelling feeling of the nasal passages feeling open. We don't try to place the sound up there, but we do want to feel empty in the nasal passages and feeling empty in the head, because if that feels blocked off, then that's going to have pressure on the larynx. That's why it's so important not to sing too down in the way we form the mouth and the way we form our pronunciation. A lot of times people fall into the trap of forming down to try to sound like they have depth. Things like this. And this is going to make the voice heavier. So a lot of times, weight, right? The weight in the voice makes us feel pressure. Because that's an excess amount of resistance to the breath, and that feels like then a buildup of pressure. So we always want to keep that feeling of keeping the mouth lifted, feeling like the upper part, what I call the upper jaw, feels lifted up so that we're never dropping down and feel like we're setting the head, the skull, on top of the larynx. We want to feel the skull lifted up off the larynx so that that's why stretching up, feeling taller, longer, or whatever, these are all very positive sorts of instructions to give to yourself so that you don't feel down and dropping stuff on top of the larynx. So deliberately closing the glottis, or doing something postural or physical that kind of applies pressure on top of the larynx. We always want to feel like the larynx down here is open to release the sound energy that we produce. Another less noticeable, or less obvious, I should say, maybe, a less obvious reason for feeling pressure at the larynx is because of registration balance. Now, registration is something that maybe on the surface people grasp pretty well, but the details of it, the subtleties of it, tend to get overlooked and not quite totally understood. So I'm going to go into that a little bit here, and then I'll talk about it in other videos and other topics as we go along. I'm sure, because it's the fundamental aspect of how we set up the voice and how we use the voice, at least in the way that that I advocate. If we are using the well, first, just in terms of registration, what I mean is how the vocal cords, the vibrating adjustment is. So how the vocal cords adjust themselves in order to vibrate. Most of us speak in what I would call the lower adjustment, or the chest voice adjustment, or the male adjustment. Even females tend nowadays, it's very normal for females to speak in the male adjustment of the voice. And it's normal for males to sing in the male adjustment of the voice. The problem with this is the male adjustment of the voice allows the folds of tissue to be thicker, which then is less efficient and also is naturally going to resist the air pressure more. So we're either going to relax it so it can be more open, so there's less resistance and it feels more comfortable. And that's where all the airflow-based phonation comes from. Or we're going to be too thick and it's going to feel either stiff or at least somewhat burdensome, especially when we try to sing higher. And then if women sing in this, that's where all this tends to come from, because when there's air releasing through the glottis, the vocal folds are always going to be thicker because they're in a more passive state. What we want, at least what I advocate we want, is we want to vocalize based on the elastic voice, which is the female voice, which is, or head voice is more commonly termed, but it doesn't, head voice, chest voice doesn't really communicate the nature of it and what it feels like and how we, and the mechanism of it. So instead of the relaxed thick voice, I advocate we base our vocalization on the elastic, thin voice. And that is the voice that we have when we speak in the female, what's the word I want? You know, in a female sort of way. All right, so right now I'm speaking you in a male sort of way, and then if I were to and I often tell people to, in order to, you know, figure out how to do this, pretend that you're voicing a character, like a cartoon character, even just simply like Mickey Mouse or something like that, so that you feel, hi, and then you speak in this, and it obviously seems rather ridiculous in that sort of way. But what the whole purpose of doing that is to start to feel what that adjustment feels like, and it's really quite interesting, because obviously we don't want to sound, I mean, I would assume that most of us would agree we don't want to sound like that when we're singing. But what happens is there's a really kind of an interesting thing that happens is when we start to vocalize in a more complete way. That's just the adjustment. And what happens is then the energy that comes from our breathing, when we start to sing more completely, fills that out, and it sounds like our normal full voice. But at the same time, there's a certain quality to it that's very gentle and clean and effortless. And I believe that is what leads people to think that it's just relaxing and using the breath that makes good vocalization. But that just gives you this. Ah. Whereas if you find your ah, 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 I'm not using more breath, I'm using a better resistance. It's an elastic resistance that gives us a better vibration, and a better vibration creates better acoustics that resonate through the openness of the vocal tract. Very simple concepts. Not so simple and certainly not easy to figure out and learn to coordinate. But it's very logical. So when we're vocalizing with this adjustment, ah, 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 then the elasticity and the lack of thickness, the thinness to the vibrating material, makes it effortless, and because it feels weightless. And that's one of the objectives of the traditional approach to the voice that I researched quite a bit, was finding a weightless quality to the voice. So now obviously saying we want a weightless voice doesn't really tell us anything about how to do it. But this is how to do it. Make sure that you're in the right adjustment. You're using that voice, even as a male. Females should have an even easier way of doing this. But the thing is that females, my experience with working with females, is they don't do this. They do passive. They just let go of the voice. So they have their male voice that they use to speak. Ah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then when they start singing, they just let go. Ah, and then they sing like this. But really, it used more breath to make it fuller. But that's falsetto. So really, a lot of women are singing with a full voice falsetto, and so it doesn't really sound like falsetto. It just sounds like kind of a really full of breath vocalization. Where what I'm saying is, have a true active female voice, head voice, thin, elastic voice sort of adjustment going on actively rather than a passive, let go voice. And then, and then for a male, when you just fulfill that, see, in my mind, I'm thinking and feeling in my larynx, but then, but then I'm expressing whatever I want to say completely. And it works the same way for the female. When you vocalize like that, there is no sense of pressure. The pressure just disappears because it's a thin, elastic resistance to the breath, weightless, effortless. Okay, so that really is the final for me, that's the final choice. That's the best answer. You know, as we see on internet question things, we'll see a big box that says voted the best answer, right? So that's for me is the best answer, and so that's the thing I want. If anybody's feeling pressure, or even if you're not feeling pressure, I encourage you to experiment with this and see what you discover, because we usually associate that voice with females, not with males, but it applies equally to males. We associate that with higher pitches, not lower pitches, but actually it has almost a magical effect on the low voice. As a tenor, as I developed this, my low voice got more and more easy and low and lower and lower, right? So it's, you know, we would think that to do low voice, we would want some sort of low voice adjustment, but this elastic adjustment, it's still, because what's happening when you use the low voice adjustment compared to, say, the relaxed voice adjustment, that note won't really phonate clean, because of the relaxed nature of it. It keeps the glottis more open, so it doesn't give us that enough clarity to tune that pitch. So the difference in those two notes were drastic. I could use, even though the first one is kind of real gentle, it's not real powerful because that's low for me, it's still clear enough that I could use it. The second one is too breathy. I couldn't use that note. It would be like, I can't sing that low. And that's true. I've worked with basses who exercise that voice. Ooh, this is based on that. And they start to sing low, and all of a sudden they've added a significant number of steps to the bottom of their range. So the reason is because I talked earlier in this discussion about closing the glottis, right? So when we deliberately close the glottis and we think of closing it in this sort of way, we're using muscles that put pressure towards each other in the vocal cords. And that's okay for just short-term strengthening exercises, but that's not an acceptable or a productive way to sing all the time. But when we activate this head voice, female voice, elastic voice that I like to call it, I prefer elastic voice, takes it out of the context of the way other people refer to things that may not be meaning the same thing I mean. When you go to this, that action is drawing the vocal cords close together, which closes the glottis without this pressure. It's longitudinal, and it stretches them out some, so they're thinner. So it's a different adjustment. It's a different sort of way of using the voice. And this is the way that was sort of standard in older generations. And that's probably the fundamental difference in how people are using their voice in singing between now and the more historical singers, who a lot of people will listen and say just seems like they were doing something different. And this is for me, this is at least part of it, if not the main part, the big part in this adjustment. So give it some experimenting on your part, and if you're interested, and see what happens. And if you if you have questions, this is always posted on the blog. You can leave comments. I appreciate that. You can write in, but comments are better because then other people can see them, and then we can have a little bit of a discussion maybe, and maybe somebody will find this in the future, and you can and they'll benefit from that too. So I appreciate you watching, and I look forward to the next time we can talk about voice stuff. All right, thanks a lot.